Welcome back. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Serrett, the website strangeplanet.ca. Coming up next, veteran audio engineer and podcaster Brendan Schexnayder explores the dark history of the American South and some of its most infamous legends, mysteries, true crime, and yes, haunted places. That conversation begins right after this time out on Coast to Coast AM. Brendan Schexnayder is a veteran audio engineer with a passion for pushing the boundaries of what's possible between your earbuds. After a long career in Music Row recording studios, helping artists like George Strait and Leanne Womack make their albums, Brandon decided it was his turn to tell stories and create something for himself. So he enlisted the help of his sister, Brianne, and Southern Gothic, the podcast, was born. Today, when Brandon isn't knee-deep in ghost stories, he spends most of his time working with other podcasters, whether that's editing or mixing audio, consulting for growth and monetization, or just goofing off talking about middle-aged dad stuff like Bigfoot. Brandon Schexnayder, welcome to Coast AM. How are you?
I'm doing well, Richard. Thank you for having me.
So, tell us a little bit about the sort of the origin story of Southern Gothic and how you decided to explore the American South and some of its more haunted locations.
Absolutely. Well, I was born and raised down in New Orleans. So, I kind of grew up with this whole vibe of telling stories and being in places that everybody said was haunted all the time, right? I mean, you couldn't throw a rock without hitting a haunted house down there, right? But growing up down there, my sister and I, we had parents who were very much into genealogy. They were very much into that before the internet, right? So we didn't have Ancestry.com. We didn't have any of the resources. You had to actually go to the library. Or in my parents' case, we had to go out to cemeteries, right? Because we needed to go and look at the tombstone, look at the headstones, and get all this information. So, we're 8, 10 years old, and we're getting drug around all these old cemeteries down in the New Orleans area, up and down the Mississippi River. And, I think something just sunk in with us that we got this fascination with stories and with just everything that has happened there. And when later in life, as you mentioned earlier, when I was looking for something that I really, truly enjoyed and was passionate about and wanted to, create a podcast about, that was obviously at the top of the list after growing up down in New Orleans. It was definitely a vibe that I couldn't shake.
So, a ghost story, I'm fascinated. It's the same way I always wonder, how a joke, before the age of the internet, would travel across the country. Someone would tell a joke in, let's say, San Francisco in a bar, and it would make its way across the country. Does it work that way with ghost stories? Because sometimes a ghost story it may start off as a local story, and then it becomes almost like part of American myth and legend. How does that happen, do you suppose?
Absolutely. It's one of the things that's the most fascinating for us about this, because we typically tell these older tales, right? We don't really talk about people joke and say, well, I haven't. Why are all the ghosts? Why isn't anybody walking around with a cell phone, right? Why don't we see an apparition with a cell phone? And, and geez, if you're into the paranormal, you probably do. But the ones we talk about are historic, and they always seem to kind of start with a kernel of the truth in some way, shape, or form. But they have these certain stages of life that they go through where, it might have this haunted house at the end of the street. You might have this awful tragedy that happened there. And then over time, oral history picks it up. And if it's a tragedy, maybe oral history is trying to explain it in some way, shape, or form. Maybe there is a kernel to the paranormal truth there as well. And then that might hit publishing. And we see this over time where we had down in New Orleans, a lot of the New Orleans ghost stories come from the WPA when they came down and started documenting old folklore back in the 1920s. And it sort of hit this point where now we had stories that had been around for, who knows, 100 years in oral history of New Orleans. And now this one gentleman who's sitting down with maybe a random mama from New Orleans asking about, that story from down the street, he's documenting it, and he's documenting her opinion, right? And it ends up in that. Then we get further down the line, and of course, more books come out, modern publishing. You have authors writing these books. In the 60s, there was a big boom of ghost stories, and stories might change a little to fit those times. Maybe they get romanticized, embellished, and then we kind of hit the next generation of television shows and television. I mean, all you guys have seen what something like Ghost Adventures or one of those shows will do with a ghost story. They'll really embellish it. And now, for just to tell on myself, of course, we have podcasts. And when it all becomes entertainment, each layer of that, it just kind of seems to change a little bit. But I do say it always starts with some type of kernel of the truth. Absolutely.
Is for you? Is it more about the story, or more about the truthfulness of the story? Because sometimes a ghost story is just a story, but there's an art to that, and it's part of the culture.
Honestly, I think what I connect with the most is the place itself, the place where the story comes from, because I think that, and I guess that leans towards the truth. I find it fascinating that all these little spots all over the South, because I do stick to this region of the American South, we all have similar stories where we go, but depending on where you're at, it has its own kind of vibe to it. It's got its own kind of a thing that comes out of that specific culture. And maybe I'm biased because I'm from New Orleans, and we're an awful proud people down there in New Orleans about where we've come from. But that's usually what I connect with, because it says something usually about that city, what's going on with that story, the angle that it takes, the type of haunting, the way that we characterize the people involved. They're always very local in kind of the way they do it, but they're with larger archetypes at the same time.
So tell me about the name of the podcast, Southern Gothic. We're all familiar with the Grant Wood painting, American Gothic. What does Southern Gothic? What does Southern Gothic mean? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, well, obviously it was a bit of a play on words with that painting as well. Southern Gothic. I look at it, the Gothic itself, that as a term. I look at kind of all those old classic authors like the Bram Stoker and that kind of Gothic literature, Frankenstein and all of that. And a lot of what they wrote about there is they wrote about this old castles and the old aristocracy, right? And it was kind of this breaking down of this culture that was elevated, and it was seen as this kind of higher society and beautiful and all, but really what these writers are writing about is how there was falling apart and it was kind of grotesque underneath it, right? And all these castles like Dracula and all this, these castles are falling apart, aristocracy is falling apart. So when it comes to Southern Gothic, people like Faulkner were writers about this as well, kind of the same theme. What we had here in the South for a very brief period of time early on. We had this plantation culture. We had the aristocracy of the plantation culture, and then we saw the downfall of that, and we saw a lot of the political and social upheavals that all went on with that and caused a lot of trauma here, to the land itself and the society and culture. And from that, its own kind of brand of ghost stories, its own kind of brand of true crime even has all been born out of this culture. So when I think of Southern Gothic, that's kind of the angle, kind of going after this Faulkner-esque kind of storytelling.
Well, let's talk about ghosts and plantations. Talk to me about the Myrtles plantation.
The Myrtles. Everyone loves talking about the Myrtles. They like to call it's America's most haunted home. That's how it's always been billed, right? And that's a story. I grew up hearing about the Myrtles down there in New Orleans, because the Myrtles itself, it's right outside of Baton Rouge. It's in St. Francisville, and the plantation was built back, I believe, it was 1796. A man by the name of General Bradford, Whiskey Dave was his name. He fled down to Spanish. It was a Spanish colony at that point in time. It was Spanish Louisiana. Fled down there because he had been involved in the first revolution against the United States government up in Pennsylvania. George Washington put it down. There was a tax on whiskey. He didn't like that. So Spain would invite anyone down to come colonize their area. He starts building his property down here in St. Francisville. And the plantation since has become known as America's most haunted home because there have been over 10 murders that have happened on the property. And since then, this is a great example of that game of telephone. It's also become a bed and breakfast. Right. So back in the late 70s, a woman by the name of Frances Kermeen Myers, she purchased the place. And, of course, to be able to refurbish it, to renovate it, she opened the doors to it being a bed and breakfast to come and visit it. And in doing that, she started telling the ghost stories and the things that she had experienced about the property. And now there are a number of them. And if you ever get a chance to go down to the Myrtles, you can take their evening tour and go through the property. But most people talk about this one legend in particular. Okay, there's this one spirit that has just become well known on the property. It's a spirit of a young enslaved woman named Chloe. And Chloe, she was back. I believe this was back in the early 1800s. At this point, it was the son-in-law of General Bradford. His name was Clark Woodruff. He was running the plantation at this point, and he had taken his own kind of concubine, if you will. This was an enslaved woman. She was probably a teenager, a lighter skin, and he took her into the house. This was going to be his, of course, quote, love interest, if you will. Moved her into the house to be close, and she was taking care of the children there at the Myrtles. She was kind of, cooking dinner, kind of the nanny for them and all of that. Well,
right.
They say over time, of course, Judge Woodruff is, he starts to wander a little bit. He's not as interested in Chloe anymore. And Chloe starts to get a little paranoid over this because she's worried that she's going to be sent back out into the fields because at least the job in the house was somewhat more cushy, so it said, right?
Mm-hmm.
But she's worried that this relationship's going sour, and one day she decides to eavesdrop on Judge Woodruff while he is in his office and he's talking business, and Woodruff finds out, and he's so furious. He actually comes out and he cuts her ear off as punishment.
Oh, dear Lord.
So, absolutely. So for the rest of her days, she walks around. She wears a turban to cover up this scar, but she goes about her business and she continues to take care of the kids. But she's still scared about getting sent back out there, right? And she's trying to find a way to re-endear herself to the man of the house. So one day she gets a bright idea. The kid's birthday, one of the children's birthday is coming up. And she decides that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bake a little bit of oleander into this cake here, just enough so the kids get a little sick. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to nurse them back to health. And, of course, Clark Woodruff, he is going to see this, and he is just going to obviously be ingratiated. I'm going to be ingratiated to him. This is going to be a wonderful thing. He'll fall back in love with me for taking care of his children. Well, you can see where the story's going.
Oh, yeah. It's going south. No pun intended.
Absolutely. So, Chloe puts a little too much oleander in these cakes, or in this cake, and the children fall deathly ill. And all three children die from poisoning over the course of the next few days.
Wow.
Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what had happened, right? And so she comes running out. Woodruff, he understands what's going on. She comes running out, and she confesses to all the other people there, all the other enslaved people out in the field, confesses to them, hoping that they might help her and save her. But, of course, they're scared because they don't know what Judge Woodruff will do to them if they harbor her now, right? So they actually take her out and hang her on the levee there. So to this day,
wow,
folks say that you can still see the apparition of Chloe. She's the most infamous apparition on the Myrtles plantation. They say she'll appear with this turban from time to time in different spots. And there's this classic Myrtles plantation photograph that they like to show of an image of her in the background. So now this story,
great story.
We were talking about the game of telephone. This is certainly one that's kind of taken on that. It's one that over the years it's a little embellished. We're not sure if Chloe really is an actual real life person or not. We've never seen on any of kind of the documentation or anything of the name Chloe itself, but she's become so popular almost as this kind of figurehead ghost of what was that bed and breakfast, that's what people come to visit Chloe now today.
But there is an apparition. We just don't know if the story attached to the apparition is entirely accurate.
Absolutely. And that's what's so fascinating about a lot of these historic stories is that, there can be these inconsistencies, but it doesn't negate the actual experiences that people are having on these properties. Because if there's anywhere that's haunted, it certainly could be the Myrtles plantation, whether or not Chloe is real or not. This was a working plantation. This was a place where there would have been massive trauma over those years. There was members of the household family who died from yellow fever. So a lot of trauma happened there. And as a result, there are a lot of strange things that happen there. Whether or not it's Chloe that's doing that or not, of course, is up for discussion. Whether or not that story is what backs up some of those sightings. But there's no way. If you go to Myrtles, whether you've heard the stories or not, you will not sleep well if you stay at that bed and breakfast.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
There's a lot going on there, yeah.
Brandon Schexnayder is storyteller, podcast producer, Southern Gothic. You moved from New Orleans. You're in Franklin, Tennessee now. Is that a particularly haunted city?
Well, it's very different hauntings here in Franklin. It's an old Civil War town. So this particular town was founded back in 1799. It was, it was settled after the Revolutionary War. All those soldiers from the Revolutionary War were paid in land grants, and that's how Franklin was founded. But what's most notable about it being haunted today is we had just this infamous bloody battle here in Franklin. It was called the Gettysburg of the South because of the carnage that happened here. It was on this particular day. It's November 30th. It's right at the end of the war. And what we have is General John Bell Hood, the Confederate general who just lost in Atlanta to Sherman. It's basically the end of the war. He's racing up to Nashville, thinking if I can get a hold of those railroads in Nashville, maybe I can save our butt at the end of the war, right? But as soon as he gets to Franklin, we're about 20 miles south of Nashville, his 30,000 troops meet 30,000 U.S. Army soldiers. So 60,000 men all meet right here in the city, in this small town. And in a period of 5 hours, we have 10,000 men died, went missing, or were wounded. So it's just massive casualties here. The population of Franklin was only a fifth even of the wounded and dead. So they were overcome with bodies. There was hand-to-hand combat in the streets. The city was being shelled during that. And all this, again, happened in 5 hours. So they didn't know what to do with all the dead and all the bodies. And, as a result of that, in our little historic downtown area down here, which honestly, ironically, is a place where they film Hallmark movies today. But in this historic downtown, 44 field hospitals popped up. So there was probably not even 100 buildings in downtown at that point, but anything that was large enough to take bodies to, they were taking folks in. Anything that still had a roof and bodies. So, I do ghost tours down here, especially during Halloween season. I did a couple tours this evening, actually, and we walk by about 10 of them, and the stories there are just thick. There's so many different things that have happened here. It's a small town. You wouldn't expect it. And when people do come visit, like I said, it looks like a Hallmark movie because it's one that's in it. But underneath is all this kind of carnage from that battle.
Brandon Schexnayder is a storyteller, podcast host, Southern Gothic. We'll take a time out, come back, and talk some more ghost stories right here on Coast to Coast AM. Standing up to 3 meters in height and sporting razor-sharp claws, as well as a beak capable of piercing a human skull, terror birds were a group of enormous predatory flightless birds which roamed the earth from 53 million years ago to as recently as 100,000 years ago, dwarfing even today's ostriches. These ferocious creatures would have been a force to be reckoned with. Now, in a world first, paleontologists have discovered what are believed to be the first ever fossilized terror bird footprints at a site in Argentina. And you can read more about this story in the News section up at coasttocoastam.com. Coming up tonight on Coast to Coast, author and popular science broadcaster Jay Ingram joins George Knapp to discuss his examination of the science and technologies that will affect every aspect of human life in the future. He'll delve into the cutting-edge research in organ and limb regeneration, advances in prosthetics, and the merging of the human with the synthetic, as well as speculate on the future of artificial superintelligence. In the second half, Richard Lang, agency director of the Aerospace Research Investigation Reporting Agency, and a UAP researcher and investigator since the early 90s, reveals how first responders have dealt with UAP issues in the past. From sheriff's offices, police departments, and fire rescue squads, he'll also share how first responders should be trained for a possible event that defies logic, current physics, and exhibits paranormal activity that may involve a vehicle of ET origin. That's tonight, Sunday night, into Monday morning on Coast to Coast AM with your host, George Knapp. Back to more of my conversation with podcaster, storyteller Brendan Schexnayder right here on Coast to Coast AM. Southern Gothic, the podcast, and you can stream it at southerngothicmedia.com, and the host, storyteller, audio engineer, Brendan Schexnayder. I want to take us down to, I want you to take us down to Georgia and Lake Lanier. There's been some, over the years, divers there have reported some pretty creepy things beneath the murky waters. They talk about freaky catfish as big as Volkswagens, and something like, what was it? The body count there is incredible. Since 1994 up until about 2020, there were over 200 people that died in that lake. What's happening there?
I believe it's much higher even now. It was like over 600 since it was created at this time. So it's fascinating. This is one of the stories that I think has really caught on lately, Lake Lanier and the curse of Lake Lanier. It's one of the kind of modern ones that hasn't been around for too long, but it's kind of built up, obviously, with a body count like this. How could it not? And, the lake, it was built, it's a man-made lake. It was built, they dammed the Chattahoochee River back in 1956. Right, and in doing this, it took about 10 years to essentially purchase all the farmland, all the bottom land out in the Georgia hills. This is right outside of Atlanta, and they had planned on making this as like an aqueduct, water and hydroelectric power for the city of Atlanta. They knew how much it was growing, and so they purchased all this farmland from all these farmers who didn't have a lot of money and paid rock bottom dollar for it as well. And they went ahead, dammed the river, opened the dam, closed the dam in 1956. And all those waters started rising on what used to be towns. So today, if as you mentioned, scuba divers and folks can go down there, and there is still structures from back in the 40s that are still there under the waters of the lake.
Wow.
So all that. There's actually even a drought. I believe it was in the early 2000s where the water level was the lowest it had been since the 50s. And there were actually some things sticking out of the lake. There was an old speedway that apparently had some stands sticking out over by Gainesville. So people got really creeped out by this, to think about, there's a city under the lake, but obviously it has earned this reputation. It's a very deadly lake. Just this past year alone, I know there's about a half dozen people actually passed away on the lake. Different reasons. Some drowned. One was electrocuted this year. So a very lethal lake. Whether that's of this curse that might have occurred, or whether or not it's we like our hillbilly fun out there on the lake. So who knows if it's a little bit of hold my beer as well. But the lake's, the lake is definitely a place you don't want to go. Now, there's a couple theories why it's cursed, why we've had all this dead. One of them, of course, is that at the bottom of the lake in these old towns and the divers going down, you can find that there are these old cemeteries down there at the bottom of the lake. And supposedly the Army Corps of Engineers, they were supposed to move all of these interred bodies because consider that sacred land all the way out to other cemeteries. And today you can go to some of the cemeteries around the lake, and there are plaques there talking about some of the tombs there. Some of the plots were folks who were moved from what would have been under the lake, but apparently they didn't do a great job of it. And some of those plots, of course, would have been little family cemeteries, right, just on their property. So maybe they missed a few, maybe they didn't. And for years, folks talked about Lake Lanier was cursed because of that. And the way that people described, I'm sorry, Richard.
No, you go ahead. You continue on.
What they described with this curse was people would be swimming in the lake, and they would say that it would feel like they're being drugged down deeper, like hands were pulling them down. That was a very common experience. a feeling that I've talked to, since we put out a podcast on the episode, we put out one back in 2019 before it got really big at that point in time. There wasn't a lot of information on it at that point. And I've actually had 3 different first responders email me and talk about pulling people out of the lake and describing similar experiences to where they felt like they were being drugged down deeper, like they were being trapped in the water, and that the lake was causing this. So it's a very lethal lake. There's other theories at the same time. This is one of those stories that's in flux right now. It's in flux as to how people are interpreting this curse. As I said, for a long time it was we didn't move these cemeteries, and when I first looked at the story, that was the main one, that the cemetery's under there, this was land that way. But since that time, it's evolved. It's evolved with people's understanding of the property and what's underneath, because underneath that lake, one of those towns is a town called Oscarville. And back in the 1920s, Oscarville was a primarily African-American community. And at that point in time, it was a lot of sharecropping and things like that. Folks owned farms there. It wasn't a very affluent community by any means whatsoever down there. But back in the 20s, there was a crime committed. A young white woman was raped. And, of course, it was an unfortunately classic Southern story we hear far too often during that time period of a gentleman from Oscarville was believed to have committed the crime. And over the course of the next month, the community from there in Forsyth County, the white community and the community of Oscarville, it just escalated there's a lot of events that led up to this final, just ultimate, horrific, violent act. All of the people in Oscarville were literally run out of town. It was just violence on top of violence. It was something that looks a lot, if you're familiar with the Black Wall Street, what happened there. Just folks being run out of town of their home. And Oscarville now sits at the bottom of that lake. So some people do believe that the curse might be part of that as well. And that's something that's a more modern giving. And we see that because TV shows are picking up on it. TV shows are picking up on that history. And they're kind of promoting that as the possibility there. So
there is a legend of a ghost of a long dead woman roaming the lake in a flowing blue dress. Tell me about her.
Yes, sir. Yeah, this is an old ghost story that's been around there for a while. So the curse is a little relatively new. But when the lake itself was first, when the dam was closed and the lake started filling up, just almost out of the gate, they were having drownings in the lake. Okay, I mean, as early as the early 50s, they already had a scuba team trained in Gainesville because of some of these problems. But in 1958 was when this particular one happened. There was two women, a woman by the name of Delia Mae Parker Young and Susie Roberts. And there were 2 local women down there in Georgia, and they were out there in the middle of the night. They were driving to a local dance, okay, at a local dance hall. And they were driving these winding roads. And if you ever get a chance to go to the lake, being out there in the middle of the night, I can't imagine. But what you're driving on is essentially the top of mountains that you don't realize are mountains because the lake water is so high now, right? Because that's what they filled in. And so these are ridges, winding roads, and they're out there in the middle of the night, probably about 10 o'clock at night, driving those roads. And at that point in time, as they neared the bridge right by Gainesville, the Dawsonville Highway Bridge, they just went right over the edge. And we have no understanding why. The next day, when folks came out and they saw what had happened, they saw skid marks going straight over the bridge and into the water. So, of course, they had the dive team come out. Everybody's come out there searching the water, everything, looking for these women. Something. It was a 1954 Ford Coupe that Susie was driving, and they couldn't find anything. Spent weeks trying to find these women down there. So they eventually just had to give up. And these women, just were, lost to time, we assume. But about a year later, in 1959, a fisherman who was out on the lake just in the early hours of the morning, he gets quite a bit of a shock because as he's out there fishing, he discovers the remains of a human floating on the surface not far from the bridge. And they are badly decomposed, just horrifically decomposed. They couldn't identify who she was even or the cause of the death. But, everybody just assumed that this was one of the women from that night, right? This had to have been Delia Mae Parker Young or Susie Roberts,
Right.
but they couldn't actually confirm it, right? So it just kind of goes on, and 31 years pass with no resolution whatsoever. But in that period of time, what ended up happening was folks began seeing the apparition of this woman in blue out on that bridge. Now, I'm sure you've heard some of the Lady in White stories, right? With the
Yes,
a driver goes down the road and picks up a lady in white, and she disappears in the car. Well, I tell you, this one is not like that. It is much scarier because they say as they get closer to this woman in blue, it looks like she's looking over the bridge or something. She's in a very tattered dress. It's just falling apart. They say it looks awful. And as they get close, they realize that she doesn't have any hands as well. It's a very, very ominous spirit at that point in time. And years have talked about this. For 30 years, talked about this lady in blue. And sometimes people say they still see her, but this is an older story in that. But after 30 years do pass by, eventually back in, I believe it was 1990, November of 1990, they're doing construction on that bridge. They're gonna expand the bridge out on Old Dawsonville Highway. And as they're down there and they're dredging the bottom of the bridge, what do you know? They found something down there. They found that 1954 Ford down at the bottom. And they, of course, they pull it up and drop it on the land. And what do they realize? That there's someone inside and still behind the wheel.
Ooh.
Right. And, at this point, they really, they weren't really able to identify the remains, but all the personal belongings in the car, they were able to find that this was Susie Roberts. This was one of those two women. She had been down there trapped under the water in 90 plus feet of water at that point. It was basically stuck within the tree trunks and the mud at the bottom because, again, this was a man-made lake and there were all trees still under there. So a lot of things down there to get stuck in. And, now this was certainly something to celebrate at that point in time, because the family
Closure,
now identify not only her body, but also the body, of the other woman, because they were able to connect the two at that point. So ever since then, that's what folks believe. They say that lady in blue, that was actually Delia Mae Parker Young out there looking for her friend who had not been found yet down at the bottom of the lake. Now, I tell people I love this story personally because it does kind of have a happy ending, but I personally learned something different from this. I went out and visited the lake. I went out and did a little extra research, and in doing so, as I mentioned earlier, I like going to cemeteries. Sorry, Richard. It's something I grew up doing, and we decided.
Yeah, I enjoy it too.
It's wonderful. It's whether it's a haunting or not, it's a lifetime of stories every couple feet. And I decided to go out to the cemetery where they were buried. It was the Alta Vista Cemetery right there in Gainesville, and it kind of I don't know if it was to pay respects or something like that. And we went out and we looked around and we visited it, because it was wonderful that now they really had proper burials. Their names were on the graves at this point in time.
Right.
But when we went up to it, got a really big shock when we went up to Delia Mae's tombstone. It was interesting because those women, they had gone missing all the way back in the 1950s, but on this tombstone was this little trinket right next to the headstone that said, "I love you, Mom." And it was at that point in time, she had a kid at that point when she went missing. And this man now has even since passed away from old age at this point. He was in his 70s. But there was just this one little reminder that these people who have been telling this ghost story about for years and years are real people. And there's a real humanity attached to what we do here when we tell ghost stories. So it just made it a little more heartbreaking for me.
When they found her body in the Ford coupe, what about her hands, Brendan?
Exactly. Well, that's exactly what they discovered, is that she didn't have hands. And my apologies to miss that. Obviously she'd been picked apart pretty badly by some of the creatures down there. So her body was, again, they weren't even able to identify the original woman who was found either, from all the decay and everything. So
No hands.
that just kind of leads into what the story said, of course. That ghost was missing her hands.
Did you ever take a swim in Lake Lanier?
I will
for
not.
research?
Would
No?
you now, Richard?
No, not a chance. Not a chance.
I tell you, I think it's up for debate. How much, what is true or what isn't at this point. But I'm not gonna risk it. No.
What is the scariest investigation you've ever conducted?
Sure. Well, I don't conduct a lot of like ghost hunting type investigations. I'm not one that I leave it up to the smarter folks to bring all the equipment out and really understand what's going on with the ghost hunts. But obviously I do travel a lot and like to go to these places. And I've been out to Waverly Hills up in Louisville, which is just notorious for having shadow people up there. And it was a very interesting place. We went between midnight and 6 a.m. We went and stayed on the property there in the middle of the night. And it's all open. It's just all concrete. It's an old tuberculosis sanatorium, and it's just sitting up there in Louisville with nothing there. And, we had a little bit of an interesting vibe there for sure. But I'll tell you, the most scared that I have ever been is actually here in Franklin, where I'm at now, this place that isn't necessarily notorious to the rest of the world.
Brandon, I'm sorry for the interruption. I'm going to get you to hold on to that story and tell us about this location in Franklin on the other side as we approach the top of the hour. Brendan Scheck-Snyder, storyteller, podcast host, Southern Gothic, Coast to Coast AM.